So everyone, these are the slideshow for the -2 readings, which is the wolf and car reading. You could separate these into two separate disadvantages, like a skimming disadvantage and a, multitasking or something like that disadvantage. But I'm gonna just group them as one disadvantage about reading and how digital media are harming reading skills. Our reading disadvantage. These arguments here are mostly from the wolf reading. But they both talk about some of these things. So she talks about how our brain is plastic. That is, that it's molded and shaped over the course of our lives. We create new neural pathways and such. And the literary brain, the part of the brain that's required for literacy, took thousands of years to evolve, and as you know something that you have to learn and develop. And she talks about how if you don't use it, you will lose it. And the worry here is that digital media is reducing that part of reading and therefore changing our brains. There's just a time trade-off, right? If we are spending more time with video games or watching videos, etc., then there's less time we spend reading. But it also changes how we read. More and more studies are showing that we do more skimming instead of deep reading. There was that one study she mentions where people read like the first couple sentences and then skim the rest of the article for keywords that they're looking for. There's also this idea of cognitive impatience in the reading. I think this is related to the time trade-off in some ways, but a different argument here that because we're used to sort of like immediate gratification, click on a link and there it is, and it's entertaining and it's really emotionally gratifying. Doing something like reading a long novel, we've become impatient for because the payoff for that takes a while to get there. There's also an argument in here about the lack of physicality, that with a book, because of it's physical and stuff, it sort of reinforces our memory because it gives a sense of there-ness. The article talks about that, like, this is more real and material. It's really actually there. And also that it makes it easier to look back. It encourages the habit of looking back and reminding ourselves of things. And studies are showing that people don't do that with digital reading. And in fact, therefore, they did that one study that people read a book on the Kindle and people read a book in paper, and the people who read the book in paper did much better when being quizzed. These arguments here are more for the car reading, but again, they make a lot of the same points. Carr talks about how there's less concentration and contemplation. When we read online, Carr's really emphasizing how the structure of reading online, like we jump from link to link and we're skimming, etc. That structure discourages these things like concentration and contemplation. Right? There's the next post to get to, and so therefore we're not really thinking deeply and pausing like we might with a book in our hand. Reading online puts immediacy and efficiency first, right? Like on demand, give me the entertainment now. I want, what's the payoff? And efficiency, think about Twitter. Can you say this in 140 characters? Can you say this in 280 characters, right? Obviously, a novel like War and Peace or something couldn't be expressed in just such a few terms. And Carr talks about how the brain starts to work like Google does, right? Google has hyperlinks and you jump between link and link and link, and our brain starts to do that, surfing and skipping, and multitasking as well, right? We have multiple windows open on our devices, and we jump between those windows, and again, that harms our ability to read deeply and read at length. So who cares? Why is reading important, right? What's the impact to this disadvantage? And there's some really good quotes and parts in both of these readings, and I wanted to just point them out. So Carr says deep reading is not just valuable for knowledge, but also the intellectual vibrations those words produce. Right? If you've ever read a book and had that sort of aha moment where you're like, oh, and you feel something profound, like I've really had this insight. Um, that might not be directly in the text, but sort of in between the lines of the text, as we say. Um, and without that kind of reading, those sorts of intellectual vibrations are not as likely. In the quiet space of reading and contemplation, our mind makes associations, fosters ideas. He says deep reading is indistinguishable from deep thinking. And I can't agree with him more here. I'm going to say something that might shock some of you, but I don't think you can be an intelligent person without reading. Part of the reason for that is that reading and writing are fundamentally kind of the process of thinking analytically, right? Analytical thinking is step-by-step thinking. So we say, this is true, therefore this is true, therefore this is true, right? And we move step by step through reasoning, and then eventually we get to more and more complex claims. And that can really only be done with reading and writing, because if you're just talking in a conversation, you lose the thread, right? It drifts off into other subjects and stuff. And so, without reading and writing, then we can't have that sort of deep, complex thinking. He says if we lose these quiet spaces of reading, we sacrifice something important, and that something important is our sense of self. We get a new self, which he describes like pancake people. We're spread wide and thin, like a network, instead of having that depth, right? If you think about a great novel, it has this depth of character, and we really learn the sort of ins and outs of the character and what motivates them, etc. Carr's worried that we're losing that sense of self, and we're becoming these selves that are more about like our connections and our networks, and a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and the harms that might come with that. There's some good impacts in the wolf reading, maybe even better than the ones in the Carr reading. She says that basically when we don't read, we lose empathy and we lose critical analysis, right? And some of the harms of that, we retreat to silos of unchecked information, so like disinformation and the problems that we're having with that, because people aren't able to critically analyze it. We're susceptible to false information and demagoguery, certainly as we've seen in the past 5 years or so. If you think the world is going insane, maybe part of that has to do with the fact that people are skimming and falling for disinformation instead of using their brains. And so deep reading is also tied to inference, critical analysis, and empathy, all of which are indispensable to learning at any age. Some potential rebuttals here. I think, using that Thompson reading, we can argue that, maybe there is some less deep reading, but still overall there's more reading and writing going on. Excuse me. Like Thompson mentioned, that in the past when people got out of school, they hardly read books or they hardly wrote anything. And nowadays on the internet, they're reading articles and they're reading posts and writing posts, etc. The same with the other literacies thing. Perhaps there's a trade-off with reading and writing literacy, but there's a rise of other literacies, and that's a valuable form of intelligence as well. Skimming can also be a valuable skill, right? There's a lot of stuff that we don't need to deep read, that we just need to find, the information about, like the who, what, when, where, and why. And if you can learn to skim well, you can get that information quicker. Sure, if you're reading philosophy or a great novel, you need deep reading. But if you're just reading a news article, maybe skimming is a valuable skill. Carr even mentions this argument here that we've heard these critiques before. Plato, way back in the day when writing first came along, wrote that writing was going to destroy people's memories and destroy people's critical thinking ability. And here we are, centuries later, and instead we're hearing people say, writing's great, and without writing, how could we ever think, right? It's sort of like grumpy old men or whatever, right? Like, grumpy old men. We heard that before. It didn't come true then. Basically, all this stuff about brain evolution. Yes, our brains are evolving, and they will evolve and arguably be more smarter because of it. Also, if you look up some of the data, books are actually making a comeback, like physical paper books. Book sales, if you include especially Kindle sales, are higher than they've ever been. So it seems like, again, more people are reading, and some of this worry is, you know, maybe it's true that if people only read online, it's worse than reading in books. But we're seeing actually more people reading in books and more people reading in general. Anyway, again, these aren't the only possible rebuttals. And today at 3:30, assuming you're watching this video on Thursday, we'll have the rebuttal day where we can come in and we'll try to share some more arguments against some of these positions. So I will see you there.